Olá, amigos e amigas. A revista Utopia do Pós-Capitalismo, o grupo Crítica Radical de Fortaleza, com o apoio da editora Boitempo, trouxeram aqui ao Brasil o conhecido intelectual canadense que ministra aulas na Universidade de Chicago, Moishe Postone. Foi um evento importante do lançamento do livro Tempo, Trabalho e Dominação Social, um livro que fazia falta aqui no Brasil. Esse livro já foi editado há mais de 20 anos na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, em todo o mundo, né? E é um livro que teve uma repercussão muito grande devido ao tema, que é uma abordagem do Capital à luz dos escritos do Grunds, de Marx, né? Notadamente o primeiro tomo do Capital, onde Postone faz uma análise do marxismo de uma forma totalmente peculiar, diversa das concepções do chamado marxismo tradicional. Ali, nesse livro, ele trava uma polêmica com essa corrente do marxismo, que ele coloca como chamado de marxismo tradicional, e nesta polêmica ele ressalta vários aspectos que são importantes dentro desse livro. A vinda do Postone ao Brasil foi um evento, como disse, de máxima importância, e nós fizemos com ele um encontro no Sindicato de Jornalistas do Rio de Janeiro, um encontro muito frutífero, onde ele fez uma palestra sobre os aspectos centrais do livro. Nós trazemos agora para vocês, num vídeo, esta palestra e esperamos que vocês façam bom proveito das teses que ali são levantadas.
Okay. I like to stand when I speak. If there's a theorist, well, first of all, let me say I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. If there's a theorist who can be said to have had a significant influence on historical practice, it is Karl Marx. It could also be argued, however, that the historical practices of each generation has given rise to its own Marx, from the positivist Marx of late 19th century social democracy, through the anti-positivist Hegelian Marx of the 1920s and 1930s, through the existentialist and then structuralist Marx of the post-war decades. This variegated tradition as a whole seemed to have been superseded several decades ago. There was a turn away from approaches inspired by Marx and the emergence of other kinds of critical theoretical approaches, such as post-structuralism and deconstruction. Nevertheless, I'm going to argue that recent historical developments suggest that Marx has renewed significance for historical practice. The far-reaching transformations of the world in recent decades have dramatically indicated that critical social analysis must be centrally concerned with questions of historical dynamics and large-scale structural changes if it is to be adequate to our social universe. They have starkly revealed the fundamental limitations of newer critical approaches as attempts to grasp the contemporary world. A focus on such transformations ultimately points to a fundamental rethinking of what is meant by history and temporality, a rethinking that I would argue can best be effected on the basis of a fundamentally reinterpreted critical theory of capitalism. Rather than considering temporality as a pre-given, unmoving frame within which all social life moves, such a theory grasps capitalism as a very peculiar organization of social life that constitutes its own historically specific temporality. It does so inasmuch as it is structured by unique forms of social mediation that are intrinsically temporal. These forms underlie a peculiar historical dynamic that is both historically specific and global. The temporalities of capitalism, then, are not extrinsic to it, but are intrinsic to its structuring social forms. The idea that the temporal dimensions of capitalist modernity is historically specific implies that the framing conditions for historical investigations of the modern world are also historically specific. This in turn suggests that historical investigation must seek to be adequate to the temporality of its object of inquiry, rather than approaching all human societies with the same concept of temporal processes. My focus on the historically dynamic character of capitalist society responds to the massive global transformations of the past 4 decades. This period has been characterized by the unraveling of the post-World War II state-centered Fordist synthesis in the West, the collapse or fundamental transformation of party states and their command economies in the East, and the emergence of a neoliberal capitalist global order. These developments in turn can be understood with reference to the overarching trajectory of state-centric capitalism in the 20th century, from its beginnings in World War I and the Russian Revolution, through its high point in the decades following World War II, and its decline after the early 1970s. What's significant about this trajectory is its global character, and this is a position from the 21st century. It encompassed Western capitalist countries and communist countries, as well as colonized lands and decolonized countries. Although differences in historical development occurred, of course, from our perspective, they appear more as different inflections of a common pattern than as fundamentally different developments. These general developments occurred regardless of which parties were in power, and were paralleled by the post-war success and subsequent rapid decline of the Soviet Union and the far-going transformations of China. Such general developments cannot convincingly be explained in contingent terms. They strongly suggest the existence of general structural constraints on political, social, and economic decisions, as well as dynamic forces not fully subject to political control. At the same time, they call into question linear notions of historical development, whether liberal or Weberian or Marxist. These general patterns also suggest that the theoretical focus on agency and contingency in recent decades was as one-sided as the structural functionalism it superseded. If the latter achieved widespread currency during the high tide of state-centric capitalism, the former has done so during the neoliberal epoch. Neither approach, however, thematized their own relation to their historical context. This suggests that that unlike such approaches, a critical theory should be able to problematize its own historical situatedness. That is, it should be reflexive. Consideration of these overarching patterns suggests the importance of a renewed encounter with Marx's critique of political economy. For the problematic of historical dynamics and global structural change is at the very heart of that critique. Nevertheless, the history of the last century also suggests that an adequate critical theory must differ fundamentally from traditional Marxist critiques of capitalism, by which I mean a general interpretive framework in which capitalism is analyzed essentially in terms of class relations that are rooted in private property and mediated by the market, and social domination is understood primarily in terms of class domination and exploitation. Within this general framework, what I'm calling traditional Marxism, there's been a broad range of approaches that have generated powerful economic, political, social, historical, and cultural analysis. Nevertheless, the limitations of the general framework itself became increasingly evident in light of 20th century developments. These developments include the non-emancipatory character of actually existing socialism, the historical trajectory of its rise and decline, which parallels that of state interventionist capitalism, suggesting that they were similarly located historically, the growing importance of scientific knowledge and advanced technology in production, which seemed to call into question the labor theory of value. This is a point I'll return to. Growing criticisms of technological progress and growth, which opposed the productivism of much traditional Marxism, and the increased importance of non-class-based social identities. Together, they suggest that the traditional framework no longer can serve as a point of departure for an adequate critical theory. In other words, consideration of the general historical patterns that have characterized the past century calls into question both traditional Marxism, with its affirmation of labor and history, as well as post-structuralist understandings of history as essentially contingent. Nevertheless, such consideration doesn't necessarily negate the critical insight informing attempts to deal with history contingently, namely that history, understood as the unfolding of an imminent necessity, delineates a form of unfreedom.